Excellent. Thank you very much, Nicola, and welcome everybody. I'm not actually chairing tonight, but I'll hand you over to our chair in a moment. But before I do, I just wanted to kind of say that today has been a day of kind of historical geography, really, at the Centre for History, and it's usually hugely pleasing to have three highly esteemed historical geographers in our presence, who I'm now just focusing on: Carl Griffin, Roy Jones, and David Harvey. And we've been gathered here for a week, I suppose, of research chat. But most importantly, David has been here to act as the external examiner for our own Joanna Rogers. Jo sat her viva on Monday, and she defended her thesis valiantly, and I'm really pleased to say that she was awarded a pass with minor corrections. So Jo, if you could just briefly come on screen, and then we can thank you and congratulate you in time-honoured fashion. Well done, Jo. That's absolutely brilliant. So, without further ado, not at all. It was hugely well deserved, and it was a fantastic performance in the Viva. Well done indeed. Without further ado, then, let me pass you over to our chair for today's session, and that's Emeritus Professor Roy Jones of Curtin University, Australia. Roy, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. If I was doing this at my own university now, I would go immediately onto automatic pilot, and I would say we are on the unceded lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. But since we're not, I will pay my respects to the elder of UHI, Ian, for bringing the band back together again. The four of us have worked on a number of projects and issues over many years now, and it's been great, and it's great to get back together. And because of that, it's also great to introduce David Harvey, who is a reader, I think, at the University of Aarhus in Heritage Studies. He was formerly Professor of Geography at the University of Exeter. As Ian has said, we're all historical geographers, which means we try and look at how places change, why places change, and what are the implications of places change. But we've all dipped our toes over the years into heritage studies, which tries to look at the way in which the past is interpreted in the present. And David is going to take this a bit further today, if I can borrow his title, which is that's the one, yes. Myth, Reality and Romantic Revelations, Tracing a Biography of Heritage on Dartmoor, which is basically looking at how the past has been seen, not just in the present, but how the past has been seen in the past. I'll leave David to take it from there.
Over to you, David.
Yeah. Is the PowerPoint up and running?
I'll just give me a minute, I'll get it up and running. Yeah.
Right.
Just hold on a second.
So we have to see us on the corner or something.
We have to shift because we're on I won't explain it,
Yeah,
but there we are.
So okay.
Oh, yeah, you're good to go. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you very much, Roy.
Sorry, Ian, I can't see any PowerPoint.
Ah, that's because I've forgotten to share it. Sorry, that's my bad. Thank you very much. There we go.
Ah, brilliant.
I'll just get us back to seeing the audience. Hold on a second. There we go.
Right. Okay.
Yep.
Right. So, great. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you very much for the introduction, Roy. And thank you very much to Jo for a really interesting Viva on Monday. It was I really enjoyed it, and I hope you managed to enjoy it as well, despite the undoubted stress of having to do these things and things like that. I knew what questions were coming, you see, but thank you very much. So this paper today explores the life history of an actual event, which is a big storm that took place in Dartmoor in the southwest of England back in 1638. By tracing its biography as represented in various texts over nearly 400 years, my hope is that this exploration of sequential narratives of pastness, if you like, a longue durée of heritage, as Roy has sort of intimated, really, the sort of the past, the ideas of the past in the past, can, as Barbara Bender suggests, be productive and lively, a revealing of a dynamic, effective register as meanings and interpretations change from a performance of divine power to a demonstration of natural phenomena, to a pantomime of magic and devilry, and perhaps also open space for reflection about the role of heritage processes and in future-making practices. So this storm took place, if it hopefully works.
Okay, well, if you don't mind, you'll just have to do the change thing.
Please.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's the one. So this storm took place in Widecombe on Dartmoor, which you can see the location there. Oh, so Ian's got right on it there. And it's about 300 metres up in the moors of southwest England. And you can see just a couple of nice photos to give you the sort of atmosphere of Dartmoor. And the next slide as well is the overhead shot of Widecombe itself. You can see the church right in the middle, and pub and a few other, in these days it's mostly car parks and so on, because it's a real tourist hotspot. So as well as a series of published texts circulated by different people at different times and for very different audiences, the memory of this storm event from 1638 can be found in material form for public viewing, literally through a church memorial that we'll have a look at shortly. The mythical qualities of the event have been inscribed upon the landscape also through its association with certain archaeological features just up the valley nearer the Warren House Inn. And it's also been used to satisfy an appetite for enchantment, I guess, to draw on Jane Bennett's ideas. Furthermore, there's a persistent connection between past, present and future within these heritage narratives, whereby a sense of pastness can act as a resource through which to become literate in future's thinking, in speculation born out of one's anxiety of present circumstance, which makes me think of when I was writing some of these things during COVID, there's a lot of sort of science fiction, nearly speculation born out of anxiety of the present. So now we need to get a bit of a feeling for the actual events in 1638. This is what I need some dry ice. Ian, come on. Run some sort of scary music and some flashing lights and things like that. Yeah. Upon Sunday, the 21st of October last, in the parish church of Widecombe, there fell in time of divine service a strange darkness, increasing more and more, so that the people there assembled could not see to read in any book. This is an account from November 1638, just a few weeks after the event. And suddenly, in a fearful and lamentable manner, a mighty thundering was heard. A mighty thundering was heard. Exactly. The strange, terrible, strange lightning therewith, greatly amazing those that heard and saw it. The extraordinary lightning came into the church, so flaming that the whole church was presently filled with fire and smoke. This is actually one of the world's first really detailed accounts of ball lightning. And since trying to write this paper, I've looked up contemporary physics, atmospheric physics books and things like that. Nobody can really quite understand or explain ball lightning. There's a lot of debate even now. So it's not really been pinned down what ball lightning, what causes ball lightning. And they were certainly puzzled in 1638. Some said they saw at first a great fiery ball come in at the window and pass through the church, which so affrighted the whole congregation that the most part of them fell down into their seats, and some under their knees, some onto their faces. With a great cry of burning and scalding, they all giving themselves up for dead, supposing the last judgment day was come and that they had been in the very flames of hell. The falling debris killed 4 people, 2 further deaths over the following couple of days, and this is all recorded in church records. And it's one of the earliest, as I said, one of the earliest archival accounts of what is thought to have been ball lightning. From reading the contemporary accounts, one can understand the congregation's astonishment here. I think, yes, you can. The lightning seized upon the ministers, this is George Lidd's poor wife, fired her ruff and linen next to her body, and her clothes to the burning of many parts of her body in a pitiful, very pitiful manner. Beside, another woman adventuring to run out of the church had her clothes set on fire and was not only strangely burnt and scorched, but had her flesh torn about her back almost to the very bones. One more man, his head was cloven, his skull rent into 3 pieces, and his brains thrown upon the ground whole. And there's still, supposedly, you can see some stains of the brain on the church floor today, as children in Widecombe were told as they were young. You can still see the scorch marks and the stain of the brain. Yeah, next one. Sorry, Ian. Yeah, so making sense of this event in 1638, and this is about the sort of circulation of the narrative, almost in the ensuing few weeks. The first account of the storm was printed in London on the 17th of November 1638, less than a month after it actually happened, and is attributed to Thomas Wykes and a Master Rothwell. It must have sold out within a few hours because the pamphlet was reprinted on the 19th of November. And then on the 27th of November, this one here came out. This is the front page of it, badly photocopied in an archive. This more detailed version came out, 27th of November. And this account is again attributed to Thomas Wykes, but this time it proclaims that the account was not grounded on information taken up at second hand, but instead contained first-hand accounts. Those persons now come to London who were eyewitnesses herein, and actually say, although thou hadst the truth in part, yet not the tithe thereof, which sounds like the sort of, it always reminds me of sort of celebrity interviews get reported today, and the sort of, this sort of trailers and teasers, they're building it up to the big day. So clearly in the 10 days between the 17th of November and the 27th of November, when this big new account came out, there's enough interest in the Widecombe storm to warrant this second publication, and perhaps the cost of even transporting eyewitnesses from Devon to London, because this new and improved account was more expensive and claims greater authority than the previous version. There's a lot of detail about the actual structure of the church, the nature of the congregation, and a bit about the investigation that happened afterwards. So, in other words, the textual biography of this episode, this storm, on the 21st of October 1638, by the end of November, it's already changing. It's sort of the story is being told and retold in a slightly different form. While the event is put down to a performance of God's power and judgment, there's also an increasing fascination, I think, with unusual elements. You can get the gist of it, I guess, with some of those quotes about some people burnt, others not. Metal objects were melting, skins scorched, but clothes untouched. There's a sense of wonder and curiosity at the uncanniness of the effects. One Mistress Ditford, sitting in the pew with the minister's wife, was much scalded, but the maid and child sitting at the pew door had no harm. One Master Hill had his head suddenly smitten against the wall, through the violence whereof he died that night, no other hurt being found upon his body. But his son, sitting in the same seat, had no harm. So these contemporary accounts also contain elements, I'd say, of everyday newsworthy sensation. Wykes talks about the multitudes who came to Widecombe to view the damaged church from diverse places thereabouts. You can see this is what the church looks nowadays. It still is a tourist hotspot, and you can just see, tourists were coming from all around Devon to visit the stricken church. Furthermore, as the account develops, you can also detect an element of scientific curiosity, perhaps even a recourse to notions of reason. Some sections of the pamphlet come across almost like an unspoken conversation between ideas of divine revelation and a sort of quasi-scientific autopsy of the event. A local man, David Barry, actually a couple of days after it happened, actually ventures up the damaged tower to investigate its condition. So he climbs up the tower and he finds a round patch as broad as a bushel, which looked thick and slimy and black around about it, to which he put his hand and felt it soft. And bringing some thereof in his hand from the wall, came down the stairs to the people and showed them that strange compound. All much wondered thereat and were frighted, none knowing what it might be. he actually tasted a bit of it and then dreamed that night and talked about his dreams. It's all in these accounts and so on. He talks about the dreams he had and so on. Now he seems to have interpreted the event as a sort of natural phenomenon in a way, describing, collecting, measuring, displaying for a strange audience, for the assembled audience, this strange compound created by the ball lightning. A sort of quasi-act of positivist science, of the briefest nod to Enlightenment empiricism. Ultimately, however, ball lightning was just not understood, and as I said, it's still not well understood. But while the is always put down to the divine justice, but while the undiscerning vagaries of divine justice seems unambiguous, you can detect some differences of opinion right from the start. According to the very first pamphlet that came out just a couple of weeks after it, there's this great line that the minister, George Lydd, exclaims that it is best to make an end of prayers, for it is better to die here than in another place. But they, the congregation, looking about them and seeing the church so terribly rent and dawn, durst not proceed in their public devotions, but went forth of the church. In other words, the minister says, there's no better place to die than inside the church on Judgment Day, and the congregation just runs for their lives. So clearly, the immediate reaction of members of the congregation appears to be far more an earthly instinct than poor old Minister Lydd, although I guess he's just seen his wife being set on fire, so he probably had other things on his mind. The storm also quickly found its way into poetic form. Two and perhaps three of those who had actually witnessed the event were there in the church, were quick to capitalise on its value and wrote poems about it over the following few months, capitalising on the public interest. That George Lydd, the guy who's had his wife set on fire, claimed to have written this short poem, which you can see here. Oh, blessed be God, forever bless his name, which hath preserved us from the burning flame. Oh, let the voice of praise be heard as loud as was the thunder breaking through the cloud. Great, and that's one of the things. Is I've been working on this with someone from literature studies, who talks about how in the 18th century in particular, I suppose the class of poem goes up in some ways as it circulates among certain sections of society, using sort of higher levels of poetic form to make their point. But the other key text that was written very soon after the event was a 4-verse poem in rhyming couplets, always known as the Great Thunderstorm, written by Richard Hill, who's the village schoolmaster who was there on the day, and this was inscribed on tablets and displayed on the wall of the restored church. And there it is. The tablets were definitely, some tablets with this poem on were definitely there in 1701. The ones you see there today replaced the original ones, as it says in the last bit, actually in 1786, right at the bottom right, you can see that. There's no way of knowing whether these verses were changed at the time, but it's my literary colleagues of mine sort of say that this looks like 17th century poetry. It starts off, in token of our thanks to God, these tables are erected. You have to try and do this in a slightly Devon accent, really. Who in a dreadful thunderstorms our persons here protected. Within this church of Widecombe, amongst many fearful signs, the manner of it is declared in these ensuing lines. So you can see within here, there's again the fascination of unusual effects of the lightning. There's the guy, actually, and again, you go, oh, there it comes up. That's right, I did it as an animation.
Oh, right.
Secret magic.
Thank you.
One man had money in his purse, which melted was in part a key likewise, which hung thereto, and yet the purse no hurt, save only for some black hole so small as with a needle made. Lightning, some say, no scabbard hurts, but breaks and melts ye blade. So you can see the people are fascinated by this. They clearly get it. This is an unusual event in many ways. It's not just a normal lightning storm. In contrast to the 1638 accounts, though, those initial ones, rather than simply proclaiming that the congregation was just being punished as sinners, these memorial verses in the church imply that the lightning was natural and that God protected the people in the church. As it says here with an animation, the wit of man could not cast down so much from the steeple upon the church's roof and not destroy much of the people. that he who rules both air and fire and other forces all had us preserved. Bless his name in that most dreadful fall. If ever people had a cause to serve the Lord and pray for judgment and for deliverance, then surely we are they. And furthermore, I'd say these narratives, within these narratives, you can almost trace an increasing recognition of how these past events can be directly connected to a sense perhaps of futurity as a prompt for future conduct. In a manner I think is not dissimilar to Holtorf and Højbjerg's appeal to future's thinking and future's literacy within heritage studies today. There's an invocation to draw on an immediate and meaningful relation of pastness in order to speculate about and crucially to prepare for what is to come. So in 1638, White notes that, as it said, we need to search our hearts and amend our ways at the best use that can be made of any of God's remarkable terrors manifested among us. And again, the next one, it seems to have got stuck a little bit. Yeah, there you go. And so it says, yeah, all you that look upon these lines of this so sad a story, remember who hath you preserved, ascribe unto his glory. The preservation of your lives who might, sorry, Angela, the preservation of your lives who might have lost your breath when others did, if mercy had not stepped twixt you and death. We hope that they were well prepared, although they know not how. 'Twas then with them, it's well with you, if you are ready now. This is sort of future preparation, using ideas of this story to conjure a sense of how heritage can be used as a future-making activity, perhaps. So there's a 17th century account of how an engagement with heritage can help us explore and come to terms with the future. This is rather like some popular accounts of perhaps of future climate scenarios at the moment within present-day Anthropocene. A strong implication, perhaps, that we should spend our remaining hours attempting to avert disaster, or at least coming to terms and preparing for Judgment Day, the inevitable day of catastrophe and judgment. So in other words, anyone reading these words should mark the power of this heritage narrative and use this to prepare themselves for what's just around the corner. And that's what some of these things I had in mind when looking at certain science fiction texts during the pandemic and so on. I'm going to miss out a bit here because I haven't got time to cover the lots of 18th and early 19th century versions and poems of the story and poems slightly more sophisticated as you go. But it is worth noting John Prince's book from 1701, in which he asserts that it is very often the wrath and justice of Almighty God, for 'tis certain such dreadful thunders and lightnings don't arise by chance. The Almighty God may permit evil spirits, the prince of the power of the air, to raise storms and tempests and to scatter abroad thunders and lightnings to mischief what they can, the children of men. We doubt not, but he uses the evil ones as his beadles and lictors to execute his wrath upon the children of disobedience. So although Prince maintains that the story was an act of divine punishment, he introduces the prince of the power of the air, or in other words, the devil. And this has an influential legacy. It's the first reference we get to this. And this is crucial here because this 1701 text on the worthies is widely read until, throughout the 18th century. It's probably the most widely published book on Dartmoor of this material up until mid to the end of the 19th century. And Prince's account of the storm seems to be the key thing that was quoted in at least 5 or 6 18th, 19th century texts. That's the one they keep reprinting, and this seems to be the key source for understanding it. So if we then go to 1876, this is picked up by writers like Robert Diamond, which I use here, and he consciously commodifies the storm in a sort of romantic story of Dartmoor legend, Gothic horror, I suppose, in his story, The History of Widecombe. And in particular, he draws on a dramatically anthropomorphized devil, recounting how a woman who kept an inn in Poundsgate. You can see here, this is where it is today, the Tavistock Inn, and the woman who kept an inn in Poundsgate, supposedly in 1638, and you can see lots about it if you go inside the pub and read all about this. She avers that a rider mounted on a coal-black steed called at her house on the day in question and inquired the road to the village of Widecombe. Unwittingly, she told him, and was immediately after horrified at the liquor which he drank, hissed as it passed down his throat. She also noticed, it goes on a bit, that he pays for his drink with some gold coins that then turned to dried leaves as he left. And then it also says, and they noticed he had cloven hooves. Sort of, oh yeah, the devil, have you? So seeing that he was discovered, the theme galloped off for Widecombe. So in the later 19th century, it's this story that starts to capture the public imagination, especially through the work of writer, tour guides such as Samuel Rowe and William Crossing. You can still find Crossing's Guide to Dartmoor in most bookshops in the area. And they further elaborate the details of a new version of the story. That one night, Jan Reynolds, and the warrener, who was a friend of David Berry, who did those first scientific investigations, was called Reynolds, but we don't know, there wasn't anyone called Jan Reynolds, who seems to be in the parish records at the time. But anyway, one night, Jan Reynolds, a bad character, paid the price of selling his soul to the devil. So he was sitting in the back of the church playing cards, and the devil, tethering his horse to one of the pinnacles, the devil burst into the church, seized Jan Reynolds, and threw him over his horse. He rode northwards, climbing ever higher into the sky. And not far from Warren House Inn, 4 of Jan's cards fell to the ground, and these formed 4 small fields known as the devil's playing cards, each one in the shape, its shape recognisable as a different suit of cards, a diamond, a heart, and so on and so forth. Oh yeah, maybe next one actually. Probably, yeah. And these are the stories that you see coming up in all the time here. So rather than the whole episode being seen as a performance of divine power and unquestionable evidence of God's wrath, here it's now clearly stated that the devil is to blame. But the devil in this story is the trickster variety. And is quite comical. In fact, he's a bit stupid. He's like a crap devil. He stops off for a pint, or rather, he gets lost while going to Widecombe, and he has to stop off for a pint to ask the way, get directions of how to find his way there. It's entertaining, I guess. So rather than being a devil that can astonish and generate terror, this is a devil who can entertain while being a little bit scary for an audience of well-to-do tourists who are fascinated by the Dartmoor landscapes and folk tales. These are the ones you can get today, which you see with these sorts of stories being circulated in. Chips and Sally Barber do loads of them actually. This sort of stuff. Hound of the Baskervilles show, Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes type stuff. This is very much connected to the rise of sort of Gothic romantic literature in the 19th century. So we've got the devil, and we've also got landscape mysteries. These devil's playing cards. And this is one of them, which you can see today. This is no prizes for guessing which one of this one it is. It's the diamond, yes. And they are weird. You look at them and you see them from a certain angle, and you think, yeah, actually a diamond and a heart for sure. The club, sort of. I get it. According to the Devon Historic Environment record, this one here is record 1344765. It says it's probably post-medieval in origin, but they're not certain. The official archive doesn't mention anything about the devil, but it does say this is an archaeological feature, has an approximate diamond plan, which I think is quite good. It also notes that the enclosure has no visible entrance, which adds to the mystery, really. There is no gateway to it. As to the equivocation, the official equivocation as to the origin, no one really knows what they said it's probably post-medieval. That's as detailed as the official records get. The fact that the stories of the devil are based unequivocally on a real event in 1638 seems to be lost here, and a causality of a casualty rather of how narratives change over time to suit circumstance. Furthermore, I think it's a bit frustrating that the good old story of the devil's playing cards obscures the probable real origin of the 4 fields in question, because these 4 fields were probably simply gardens used by mine workers during the 18th and 19th century, No entrance. You wouldn't build an entrance in a garden in that area because there was huge amounts of rabbits in the area, a lot of warrens, hence Warren House Inn and so on. Lots of rabbit warrens, and so you needed to have any garden protected. You don't want gateways of any sort, so you put a proper wall all the way around. So in other words, there's a bit of a hint of irony in a way that behind all the stories of romantic mystery, there is perhaps a shadow of other people's lives on the moor. The marginalised stories of the lives of copper miners, tin workers in the gold and dagger mines and the birch tor mines, that you can still see some traces of, but they don't seem to figure very highly in any of the folks tales, and Chip Barber and so on doesn't seem to talk about them in the Legends of Dartmoor book. So in some ways, I guess this can be seen as an example of heritage from below. Unusually, perhaps, I think it's interesting that the folkloric renditions of the story tend to overlook the politics of local and situated lives of individuals in the moor in favour of romantic stories about trickster devils. Indeed, perhaps this account adds complexity to people like Jane Bennett talking about we need for forces of enchantment. Tim Adenza talking about we need more spaces for the forces of enchantment, a plurality of narratives and an understanding of multi-temporalities. Yeah, it's all well and good, but you have to remember this endeavour shouldn't act to marginalise how placemaking is practiced through such heritage work, how some narratives seem to be more important than others here. The stories of real people, probably migrant workers scratching a living on the moor in the 19th century, almost at exactly the same time as stories from the devil are starting to circulate. They're excluded in favour of romantic mysteries and Gothic ghost stories that are much more popular with the tourists, who probably don't like to think they're actually visiting an abandoned industrial site. So, moving on here, to conclude, last one here, has got a few things. The 1638 storm provided symbolic capital that was developed and deployed in numerous ways. It formed a dynamic textual heritage with an ongoing life history, which is now nearly 400 years in the making. Elements of this textual heritage were represented and used to suit different needs. One more there. That's it, yeah. So first, these needs include the keeping a congregation on the path to salvation, with stories used as evidence of the power of both God and the power of the devil at different times and in different ways. Secondly, you got in the shadow of these ideas about God and the devil, the extreme rarity of ball lightning. It was recognised at the time, was talked about at the time, and induced a clear sense of curiosity that heralded nascent scientific investigation in the days following the event. Thirdly, in addition to these sort of quasi-rational and theological reflections and debates about the nature of the world, the event also provided a useful resource for storytelling, whether that's feeding a market for sensational news stories in the 17th century, you want to hear about people's brains being clothed and so on, or as romantically desirable stories of myth and magic in the 19th and 20th centuries, to enchant readers and tourists alike, and still do today. Fourthly, the event is also used to account for four strangely shaped fields. There are parallels perhaps between the conversations of archaeology and folkloric magic in the 20th century and those between theological reflection and the vestiges of science in the 17th century. And then finally, you've got these instructions towards future conduct, a strand of future's capacity building perhaps, that although we might not be able to change the future, we can at least use heritage as a resource for coming to terms with it, perhaps even through a sort of science fiction and Gothic horror stories. So the life of the Great Storm of 1638, the life history of this storm, shows a dialogical form of heritage, a chiasmus that blurs timeframes, myth and reality in a fluid and folded manner. This is a story of intertextuality and a dialogue between the church and science, a dialogue between folklore, archaeology, tourist literature and ghost books, but also perhaps with Anthropocene and existential anxieties of different ages. And we should always recognise this within the context of more everyday concerns of ordinary people trying to make a living, scratching a living in challenging and marginal landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. end the show, and then I'll jump back to WebEx and over to our chair.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. And I will turn this over to everybody else who has been hearing this dialogical account of the whole set of, for want of a better word, I say explanations, I might ought to say rationalizations of what happened in 1638 and how people have seen that in different ways at different times. And as David said, all overlapping. I will trust that Ian can handle the technology of questions coming in through the ether, and I'll open it up to all of you to put questions, comments, and views to David before, at the conclusion, I will get Professor Carl Griffin to sum up and respond. Okay. So it's over to you.
So folks can use the chat function if they want to ask their questions, or just yell out. There's not that many of us assembled here, so just plunge in, folks, and of course round the table as well. The floor is open to all. I'll just get the chat function up here just to make sure that we've got space. Well, there's Joe thanking us to start. Right.
Okay. Well, while everybody else is thinking, I'll drop in a name that came to me repeatedly while you were talking, and that name was Tom Selwyn and his ideas of hot and cold authenticity. The fact that while people at one level are trying to make coldly authentic, this is really what did happen, rationalizations, there is a perennial tendency or temptation to find the dramatic, the hot, the thing that brings in good and evil. You know, sort of, when Selwyn writes about authenticities, he does this, and you could almost relate it to Umberto Eco's stuff, you know, the romanticization of the Middle Ages.
Yeah. No, it's good, because the other thing with this is it strikes me in, if you read I've forgotten the name. So is it the 17th century? Never mind. There's this sort of big fat book on environmental histories of 17th century. There's all sorts of
Just on
amazing
things. Short, Blackhead.
No, I'll think about it. Yeah. But it's sort of that. It's reasonable to assume that some of this stuff is that's
not Keith Thomas, the religion of climate magic.
Man in the natural world.
No, I'll think of it in a minute. No, but there's a I guess there's the drama is clearly selling, and you can see that. But I guess you can put this in sort of temporal and spatial politics of this in a way that for people in very locally, they actually can go along and see the stuff and actually go and visit, and they might have relations there, and they're much more likely, I think, with the school teacher and so on. They're not going to. None of these people were sinners. This is just like that's the sort of thing that God does. In London, they seem to be really titillated by it, and much more likely to be thinking, "Oh, they're all sinners, really. These people at Widecombe must have done something wrong." And so there's a sort of there's a sense in which there's a sort of I guess the hot and coldness can be seen as sort of just, have you got relations there or not got relations there, as to what stories you're allowed to tell and what sort of stories you get circulated as a result, and how it gets used, and I guess there's a, for want of a better word, a class basis to some of these things as well, in terms of the way in which the sort of higher forms of poetry associated with this very quickly deal out the sin to people in Widecombe. It's all their fault, and in that sense, there's a sort of, again, there's a sort of maybe a social distance from the near victims of this.
Yeah, they're making a sort of moral tale from the high to the low.
Yeah. And it's certainly, we're trying to work our way through exactly how to make sense of all the accounts, and especially where a lot of them are very clearly just using someone else's account and adding and just making stuff up as people want to do. And then, yeah, by the time you get to 19th century, and it's made probably simplistic, but yeah, God is a nice cuddly man with a big beard, and he doesn't do things like smiting people who were innocent. So then the devil is a much better actor in this sort of stuff to invoke, to sort of to say, oh yeah, it's all the devil, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know the 19th century literature well enough to think is this typical of sort of trickster devil as this sort of slight. He's a comical figure.
It's almost as other religions, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have in Buddhism and Hinduism, you have the tricksters.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Christianity.
Yeah. But he's certainly if you go and buy, you can get postcards, and you get lots and lots of. Every bookshop on Dartmoor will sell you the stuff. And it is intriguing that you can actually just go into the church, see the account, and that's still there. But you don't see that account circulated a great deal. Instead, if you go into buy all the ghost stories, the ones which people buy are all about the devil and Jan Reynolds and the devil's playing cards. And you can go and walk down to see the devil's playing cards at just near Warren House Inn, and there's sort of lots of funny layers going on here.
Okay, back to everybody else.
So we've got a couple of questions on chat there. We'll take Malcolm's first. I think you can. Do you want me to read that out? Everybody should be able to see it, but
yeah, it's incorporate various folk motifs. Absolutely, but it's a funny thing in some ways. Some of the core folk motifs in terms of the devil and the accounting for because in some ways they've done some work on Cornish saints, and they're very keen, and from really early on in medieval, of saying that tree over there, or that's from Saint Samson's time. Saint Samson did something. Saint Gwynia cut that rock into two. That's why you see it like that today. And it's and they're talking about thousands of years ago, or 1,500 or more years ago. Yeah, so a good long time ago. And you can see these, and you imagine these sort of stories being passed on and written about a bit in saints, in hagiographies. And I just find it odd that in this case, that motif of it accounting for archaeological features, that in a lot of cases you think, oh, that must be very old because this is a really long traditional motif. No. It's demonstrably, it's not old. It really is made up, and it really does seem to be made up by quite well-to-do tourists who are going down there. There doesn't seem to be a folk, as far as I can make out. I don't think there's an oral history, an oral legend that is earlier than these 1870s, 60s, 70s, where people start talking about the devil and the devil's playing cards. And it's interesting when I've seen some oral histories of, these are recordings that you can get hold of now. The story of the stain of the brain, the stain of the brain, and other bits within the church, which does relate to the real events of the ball lightning striking the church and making the bit of the pinnacle fall down and crash through the roof of the church and so on. That one does seem to be there and is told to school children when they go to, they were told to school children in the 20s and 30s, which is when the stuff recorded in the 1980s, 1990s, I think. That one is there, but not the devil's playing cards. And so you think a lot of it, devil's playing cards, archaeological site, that must be the sort of folk tales. But it doesn't seem to be in this case. That seems to be the made up stuff.
That's really interesting. Have you been inside the church? Have you seen the stain?
No. And again, it's sort of, it's there, and I've looked for it and I can't find it. But yeah, children are still told, or at least they were told in school not long ago. St Cuthbert, yeah, absolutely. I
was going to draw your attention to that one because there's all sorts of gods from the classical myths, firing lightning bolts and all this kind of thing. It crops up quite a lot.
And there's another really good account of a big flood which again caused the destruction of a church in East Anglia, somewhere in Suffolk, I think, in 1570s. That again had quite a lot of poetry and stuff written about it, and some stuff that's been churned around. ever since, but not to the extent of here. And there's no lightning, there's no brains. There's just 3 or 4 people were killed, I think.
You've just nicked one of my questions, actually. So I was going to ask about you're not in 1638. You're not that far away from the supposed tsunami on the Severn.
That's true.
Are
Yeah,
you?
I thought of that. Yeah.
And there are lots of kind of popular cultural kind of myths around that. But from my recollection, you don't get, let's call it the tourist gaze of the trickster devil and the kind of the playing cards. That doesn't seem to feature around the tsunami at all. That almost gets forgotten. Certainly in popular memory, it kind of just vanishes, and it's just an intriguing difference between the two, and they're quite similar, and they are kind of natural disasters. Similarly natural disasters. It's not a question; it's an observation, really. So there's some good observations on chat, and I see David's got his hand up as well.
Yeah, well, ask David, and then he's just around the other corner of the room. Yeah. Hello.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, David. Yeah, I'll come through to the other room in a minute. But I was telling you before that I've written a book about a scholar and minister from near here, and he writes all sorts of accounts of terrible weather. He usually ascribes it to divine retribution, but not always. And when the main factor in weather, there are lightning strikes, thunder strikes, not on churches, things like that, kill people. He's very troubled by it. But the main thing that troubles him is wind. I mean, wind in the environment, and he doesn't ever ascribe wind-related devastation to divine retribution. But the thunder strikes and lightning strikes he does. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on wind as a factor in weather-related destruction and how that might be, probably isn't memorialised or made into heritage in any way.
Yeah, it's a good question. This is the one in, I think it's Bungay. Is that Norfolk or Suffolk, somewhere in East Anglia? That's really heavy rain in a rainstorm, and then such rain. This one is thunder. Well, lightning, obviously. The stuff in Cornwall seems to be more giants and dragons again. So I can't think of any more windy examples in the southwest of England, at least.
If you've got to go much further away for a divine wind or a kamikaze.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
And I was also thinking, if you're thinking of along the lines of natural disasters, and you want kind of a more everyday kind of markers of natural disasters, it's flood marks, isn't it? Flood marks on pub doors, on bridges where the height of the flood came. The most the one that springs to mind closest to here is the Muckle Spate. That's the only bit of the history of that I can remember at the time. It's kind of Aberdeenshire, I think, but I could be wrong about that. There's been a lot of work recently, hasn't there, been on kind of flood markers as kind of ways of materialising memory. And some of this is exactly that, but it's also, isn't it? It's kind of twisting memory to suit various discourses.
Does this stuff on flood markers include, sort of places that were spared and places that were destroyed, or anything?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm thinking more, the everyday occurrence. Your annual flood, Severn is a really good example, but the Wye as well. Annual flood. It gets here on the pub door and somebody marks it, or it gets here on the balustrade of the bridge and somebody marks it. And sometimes they become kind of permanent memorials and you get a little plaque, but more often than not, they're just a mark, that somebody's made to say, here's, a record. And often there's a date against it as well. And sometimes they pass into kind of, authorized heritage almost, and they get preserved by local museums, or more often than not they just kind of vanish as well over time. They're really interesting things, blood markers.
I'm just looking now at Lindsay, and has made a couple of. Oh, sorry, yeah, Lindsay made a couple of, and I haven't come across St Cuthbert and the actual lightning bolt, but and I was just wondering, because in some senses that sounds quite similar to the start of the actual 1638, but the way it transforms in Devon, at least, from the people being struck and killed. They're just bad luck, aren't they? They're not particularly sinners, but I mean, the minister's wife was one of the ones who gets killed in the initial thing, and she would be presumably beyond reproach. So it's just, well, God work, that's what the God does, and it's later on that it's very much casting at sinners. I was just wondering, asking Lindsay, is it still a case that it's just, well, that's St Cuthbert then doing his thing, or is it a case that the devil there is used to, does it change the devil, or is it just St Cuthbert is good enough to account for these things? And why, therefore, it seemed to be swapping to the devil in this example in Devon? And I don't know, why was it not good enough just to be God doing stuff? Or is it simply is it simply just a sort of like titillation or romantic?
Lindsay's still with us, so.
Is it just a case of the devil sells more books in the 19th century, particularly with the Hound of the Baskervilles there and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, Lindsay is still with us. Lindsay,
I'm here. Definitely not my main area of expertise, but in the work I've done on charters and religious houses in the north of England and the south of Scotland in the Central Middle Ages, I mean, Cuthbert's a wrong one, isn't he? He's really focused on jurisdictions and demarcations, and that's fascinating. There's a lot of different stories that come up out of that. So if women step past a specific point in Durham Cathedral, their feet are supposed to be nailed to the floor by the saint, who's very keen that people remember their places. So the culture of official and less official hagiography's attempts to try and canonize figures of other importance who aren't Cuthbert are very, very focused on jurisdictions and trying to find a space that works in and around Cuthbert. And so a really good example is the founder abbot of Newminster Abbey, Robert, is a really interesting person, and one of the parts of his vita is about an incident involving a beast that tends to wander off, and a naughty person decides, oh well, if I cut its hair and to make it a little bit less noticeable, I can eat this is mine now. And we go and swear on Cuthbert's tomb, and Cuthbert lets him away with it. But when they step back across into Newminster Abbey's territories, because that's the house that the beast has been stolen from, it's only when he steps back onto Newminster's land and that the problem becomes apparent. He's struck dumb and in terrible pain, and he has to go and make amends to Robert. So there's this lovely culture, perhaps because it's a border region where people are trying to negotiate all of these things. Hagiographies, are fantastic sources. So, but Cuthbert is really particularly focused on, or his hagiographers are really focused on using him as a way to reinforce social order and norms. It's fascinating.
So sort of people's conduct being subjected to sort of various forms of environmental control, perhaps with the lightning or something like that, being used to. So it's like, who gets the agency to make that, in a sense, or is allowed that agency? I don't know. I think
Sorry, I don't know enough about the theology, but the elemental natural stuff is fantastic. They're also very interested in who can identify the location of shipwrecks. This is something that's been particularly associated with saints along the northeast coast. It's really very highly prized skill. So there's this moment where people like Robert and Cuthbert stop and they go, I know there has been a shipwreck and that's where it is. Let's go and find them. and this control of this relationship with the environment is fantastic. I don't know enough about the theology of where the impetus comes from, where the energy of the lightning comes from. in terms of medieval theology, but I just know that the stories are fantastically vivid and rich sources that I don't know that they've been explored in enough.
I've got another completely left of field comment, so I've had one go. So did anybody else get any observations, queries?
I have a question, but I can save it for dinner, so carry on, you know.
Okay, just occurred to me while you were talking about the thread where, you know, the goodies get spared and the baddies get hit. There may be some literature, there was certainly some conversation related to the Boxing Day tsunami, particularly in Sumatra, which is the most devoutly Muslim part of Indonesia, about the tsunami coming in and the mosques being spared. Now, my cynical reaction, of course, is they were probably built on the prominent places in the villages anyway, but there may be some literature on this which might give you a totally different time and space, you know, lead into the same thing.
I know, I've heard stories before. I think there's a lot of if you see a church, there's St Michael's. Churches which are dedicated to St Michael's, apparently, I've not done any research on this to know if it's true, they're often placed on tops of hills, more so than most St Michael's, supposedly.
St Michael's
which might mean that they might be safe from the flood, but get hit by lightning or wind. Or wind, yeah, I don't know if that's true.
Okay, does anybody have any other comments or queries before I invite Carl?
I was quite intrigued by Malcolm's question, really. I wasn't sure we had picked it up entirely, you know, the question of when the process of incorporating folk motifs into the telling of event, when did it fizzle out? I'm not entirely certain it does fizzle out.
Well, then we get back to the Boxing Day tsunami.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think just folk motifs change, and there's different folk motifs.
I'm reminded actually of my uncle Percy, my dad's first cousin Percy. He would always say when he was young, in the 1930s in Cornwall, as a young boy, when all the Methodist churches of the area were strongly Methodist. In the family at least, when they all supported each other's, although they're all together in the one United Methodist Church, but all the different chapels were secretly trying to undermine each other all the time. And he was always instructed by his family to go out and stamp on snails when there was an event taking place, a fundraising event for one of the other churches, particularly the Wesleyans, because my family were all United Methodist Free Churches. When the Wesleyans were doing a big event, my Uncle Percy and others would go and stamp on snails, and that was to encourage rain. So they would flood their parade would be rained off because my Uncle Percy had stamped on snails.
That's amazing.
Anything else before I call on Carl?
I'll just check that there's no further questions snuck in. Doesn't look like it.
No. Okay, well, thank you all for your questions. I'll pass it over to Carl.
Hang on, I'll get you on camera.
Oh dear.
Other way.
Oh
No,
God!
no, that's the right way.
Hang on, I'll just zoom out.
Gosh,
It's a long way out.
you'll need a to do
There
There
he
we
is.
go.
There he is.
Oh, okay. So, thank you so much, Dave. Some thoughts and reflections. In Widecombe, they're still kicking the devil out. In Easter, I can't remember the precise date, 1996, I was chucked out of the Rubblestone Inn.
You got your own devil by the devil. Yeah.
I was there holding a clipboard and that kind of most devilish form of the undergraduate student undertaking field work.
Was that the Bristol field trip?
It was the
That used to
Bristol
come
field
to
trip.
yeah.
The landlord of the pub strode up to me, said, "Off with your students' questionnaires."
That sounds like Rubblestone.
And that was my kind of first kind of introduction to kind of Widecombe. So they're still kicking out devils now, and that's interesting.
Did you pay with dried leaves?
I didn't, but I did set
Proper
fire to
student
the bar.
funding. Yeah, sorry.
your talk kind of speaks in so many ways to so many kind of interests and so many kind of ongoing debates. One thinks, of course, of the rise of recent work in what very briefly was called weather history, but now, of course, has been kind of relabeled as kind of climate history. So much undertaken by kind of interdisciplinary teams of kind of historians and geographers. Perhaps kind of most kind of powerfully, I was kind of struck thinking about the connections to the work of people like Andy Wood, not least his 1999 paper in the Transaction of the Royal Historical Society on the on social organisation and writing in early modern England. His kind of emphasis on the importance of textuality is kind of an important kind of facet of rural cultures at a time where so often we're kind of forced, where so much kind of thinking has been kind of instead kind of focused on say the work of John Albury in kind of Wiltshire and the importance of the oral tradition, the written word and the way in which kind of past stories were actually textualized, I think is really, really important. I think it's kind of a nice example of that. But also the way in which I think it's been kind of a relatively kind of powerful recent kind of resurgence in sort of in social and kind of cultural history, thinking about the power of the past and the mutability of the past in much kind of work, at least on English history. And I don't know the work in Scottish history so well. I'm thinking particularly so kind of Paul Redman's kind of recent paper in the English Historical Review of the cultures of kind of writing kind of history. Apart from some of his earlier work as well, on the importance of medievalism, say in the 19th century. So I think there are these interesting kind of lineages as well. And of course, I suppose one could argue that in writing kind of any history, writing any kind of heritage, what are we doing? We're always kind of engaged in thinking about trying to kind of make sense of the past in the present for the purpose of the future. So I think there's that kind of interesting scholarly kind of going to be a continuity with folk practices too. Beyond that, there's some kind of other kind of observations, and I think we've got butting kind of earlier as well. But I was trying to think where the kind of connection came from, but then it struck me that, of course, St Paul's was struck by lightning in 1561, and in 1638 they were still repairing St Paul's after that disastrous kind of lightning strike. And when the English Civil War kind of breaks out in 1642, that work is still ongoing. And when the Civil War kind of breaks out, it's used as kind of a cavalry barracks. So there's kind of an interesting point there. So the power of kind of lightning and its transformative effect on kind of churches, not least kind of the most kind of celebrated and powerful kind of church in the nation, no doubt would have been known in Widecombe, and that must have kind of informed kind of local thinking and making sense of what was happening. As must have the way in which the Bible itself talks about thunder and lightning, not least in the book of Revelation. I've just kind of searched for it here. I couldn't remember across. Quote, Revelations 4, verses 5 to 7. Lightning and noise and thunder came from the throne. 7 lights of fire were burning before the throne. There were the 7 spirits of God. So lightning, is kind of used throughout the kind of Bible. So kind of in many ways, but in the contested book of Revelations, it often kind of symbolizes not the coming of the devil, but the coming of the spirits of God. Which is kind of interesting. But I'm not sure in the religious kind of culture of Devon at the time, but in the Lutheran tradition, the book of kind of Revelation, or rather the book of Revelation, was not accepted at all. I think is in the East Orthodox Church, it's still not accepted as a book the book of the Bible because of that, those kind of those apocalyptic, sorry, I can't even say the word, apocalyptic images. And so it can really be a proselytism. It's, it's going to be a lot of those kind of images kind of not very problematic at all. But the fact that that sort of kind of alluded to already, this comes in 1638 in this period of kind of English kind of history, where so much is bubbling up, where there is such ferment, where there is such kind of social and religious lightning itself, and a point at which the zest, the demand for kind of for popular accounts of the dramatic and the unusual are at kind of levels never seen before. Partly because of the advances in printing technology, but partly because of the fervour of the times. Again, must have had some kind of impact upon the way in which both the event was kind of received and the way in which it was subsequently kind of made sense of and textualised. So I think I'll stop at that point. But thank you, David. Really, really fascinating. But beautifully told, beautifully kind of rendered story, which is so suggests and speaks to so many other kind of really kind of rich, powerful debates.
Thank you. And let's do a couple of things on there. Is that first, the text on the church tower does have some biblical quotes, and I think there might be something from Revelation. But we could go back and zoom in on that. So I've got there. But also, yeah, there's stuff on textual, I suppose, textuality and heritage, textual heritage. There is a very good book coming out in 2024, edited by Edoardo Gallini, with a chapter by me in there, which partly draws on this, but also connects it to science fiction and climate fiction. Actually, there's sort of J.D. Ballard writing "Hello America" and and a few other bits like that. Sort of the sort of coming catastrophe can be witnessed, and the sort of apocalyptic stories told through in fiction again. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, I'd like to thank everybody for their inputs, in particular Carl and David, of course, for a really fascinating talk on topics that are still relevant almost to today, in things like Great Balls of Fire and playing cards in church. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Carl for response and Roy for teeing up. Yeah.
And thank you all to my colleagues for such a wonderful historical geographical day. Nicola, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was the last of the current season of History Talks Live. We resume again in September, and we will be publicising our September and October, and almost certainly our November talks quite soon. And so watch the History Talks Live website for future updates. In the meantime, thank you all very much, everybody. Some people have gone off for tea already, which is a great idea. I'm going to be shortly following them, so thank you very much, and cheery ho, everybody.
Yeah, bye.
Yeah.